especially want to welcome everybody online, wherever you are, vacationing or just chilling, maybe at the lake or out camping or traveling. It's so great to have you with us today, and that you're setting a priority to be at church even wherever you are. And of course, everybody here at the factory, it's a long weekend, but we're having good church together today. And it is the long weekend. It's a Canada Day long weekend, which means it's time for a Canada Day themed game. All right, are you ready? So at the end of your row here in this room, you will find a little game card, and if you're lucky, a pen. Love everybody, really quick, just hand those game cards out. Hand a pen out. If you are at home, grab a piece of paper and a pen. You guys are going to especially have to write quickly. You can use abbreviations if you need to play our game. And we're just getting those cards handed out and the pens handed out here in the room. I'll tell you how this game is going to work. This game is going to work where I'm going to give you a two-word description, and I'm expecting that you are able to tell me who that person is, that you can identify them by a two-word description. So you got a little game card here. In a moment, we'll put them up on the screen. Just in case you're reading through the game card and you're wondering who Lois Riel is, that's Louis Riel's little sister. Okay, but this is supposed to say Louis Riel. All right, so yes, we have a spelling mistake there. Here's how the game works. The game works that if you are able to identify this, you're playing for a prize. In fact, you're playing for a $10 Dairy Queen gift card today in the room. No cell phones. You are not allowed to call a friend on this one, so put your cell phones away, no smartphones. If you were in a previous service, you may not win a prize, okay? And also, it's for those who are in the room. Unfortunately, those at home, we are not able to provide a prize for you. And of course, we're also playing on the honor system. You're at church. Come on. Don't lie, okay? So we're going to be honest about this. Ready? We're going to cue the game music, all right? Build up the anticipation, and I'm going to put the names on the screen so you can familiar yourself with them right now. Here we go. Let's get those names on the screen, and we'll begin to familiarize ourselves. And in a moment, I'm going to give you a two-word description. If you're writing them down, you can use an abbreviation for that two-word description if you want, because it's going to move fairly quick, and we're going to work our way to a winner. You ready? All right, here we go. First one, social mutineer. Who on that list is a social mutineer? Just, you can put down the word social mutineer or even SM beside it, and that would be great. Next one, the great conciliator. The great conciliator. Who on that list is a great conciliator? You don't have a lot of time. You got to be quick on this one. Moving on to number 3, the Hoff. Who on that list is referred to as the Hoff? Number 4, Scarborough's Shrek. Who on that list is Scarborough's Shrek? Two-word description. Number 5, Sweet Messenger. Who is the Sweet Messenger on that list of names? Canadian names. These are all Canadian historic figures or celebrities or people of interest. All right, we're halfway there. You're doing great. Next one, Medicare architect. Who is the Medicare architect? All right, working our way towards the end. Playhouse protester. Which Canadian personality is a playhouse protester on that list? Just 3 left. Here we go. Broadcast billionaire. There is a broadcast billionaire worth $57 billion. Richest Canadian is on that list. Last 2, Hoop Dreams. Hoop Dreams. The inventor of basketball is on that list. He's a Canadian. Hoop Dreams. And finally, Mean Notebook. Mean Notebook. Which personality is identified by Mean Notebook? Okay, that's it. That was a quick round, and we're going to find out who wins. I'm going to go through the answers for you, and you can check, and then you tally them up, and at the end, you should have a number of how many you had right, okay? Here we go. Social mutineer. You can yell it out. Who's a social mutineer? Louis Riel, or on our paper, Lois Riel. Yes, Louis Riel is the social mutineer. Great conciliator was Sir Wilfrid Laurier, the 7th Prime Minister of Canada, negotiating compromises between French Canada and English Canada. All right, who knew the Hoff? Who's the Hoff? Oh, it's quiet in the room. Justin Bieber. Justin Bieber, his nickname is the Hoff because he's cool and successful like David Hasselhoff. All right, I didn't make that up. That's out there. Scarborough Shrek was Mike Myers, of course. Yes. Sweet Messenger was the daring Laura Secord from history who brought a message, but also a chocolate company hijacked her name. Medicare architect. Tommy Douglas, yes, a Baptist pastor who was the 7th Premier of Saskatchewan and invented Medicare. Playhouse protester. It's getting quiet in the room again. A black woman who challenged the whites-only seating in theaters in Nova Scotia in 1946, Viola Desmond. Viola Desmond. All right, broadcast billionaire. Yes, David Thompson, richest man in Canada, $57 billion. Hoop Dreams, a Canadian Christian chaplain and doctor who invented basketball, James Naismith. Mean Notebook, come on, who was it? Rachel McAdams, the woman who broke onto the big screen in Mean Girls and Notebook, the movie's Notebook, Rachel McAdams. All right, do your tallying up. Everybody stand if you're able in the room. Everybody stand right now. Stand up, everybody, okay? If you got 4 or less right, sit down. 4 or less right, sit down. 5 or less, you're sitting. 6 or less, you're sitting. We're working our way towards the winner. 7 or less, you're sitting. 7 or less, we still got some people standing. 8 or less, you're sitting. 8 or less, it's coming down to a few. 9 or less, you're sitting. 10s, we got 10s. We got 10s. We got 4 10s in the room. 4, yes, we got 4 10s, 5 10s in the room. All right, tiebreaker. First one to tell me, how old is Canada? Over here, 156, I heard it. There it is for Joe. Joe's got it. Let's hear it for Joe. Good job. 156 years. Yeah, so it's really interesting that you can identify all these people, or most of you did anyway, with just 2 words. A 2-word description to summarize their entire life to help you identify them. Well, we're studying a guy this morning and this weekend named Elijah, and if Elijah had a 2-word identifier, it would be this: effective prayer. He was an effective prayer. When this guy prayed, stuff happened. So we're into week 4 of a 12-week summer series that we're calling Wherever You Go, Exploring the World of Prayer. Because here's the deal. We know you're going somewhere. Half of Riverwood has disappeared. You're out somewhere. You're working on the yard. You're at the cabin. You're road tripping. You're getting on an airplane and flying far away. You're going for a walk in the park. You're just chilling in the backyard with a barbecue. You're somewhere. And as you go, we love that. We love summer. We love the fact that we can go places. We do encourage you, if you're in the city, come to church. Give this as a priority. But we're going to be gone lots of places. But wherever you go, take your connection with God. Take prayer with you. And we'd encourage you to take this teaching, to find the teaching. We make it available to you, and we'd love for you to connect by YouTube or podcast every week so that you're stirring up your faith this summer. In the Bible, there are 222 actual prayers prayed by people. We've studied Jonah, we studied Hannah, we studied Peter last weekend, and this weekend we are going to do a deep dive into the life of Elijah. Now, Elijah's entire life is captured in 8 chapters between 1 Kings 17 and 2 Kings chapter 2. And it moves pretty quick, and in those 8 chapters are 4 specific prayers that Elijah prayed. We're going to take a look at them today, okay? You're going to have to kind of stick with me. We are first introduced to Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 1. Now Elijah, who was from Tishbe in Gilead, told King Ahab, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, the God I serve, there will be no rain or dew or rain during the next few years until I give the word. Now, that begs a question. Why did God turn off the taps to the rain? Why was God willing to have these people become parched for actually 3.5 years? No rain. 3.5 years. What was going on? Well, God had very good reason. The nation of Israel, his people, were divided into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. All said, they had 39 different kings in these two kingdoms. If you want to take a two-word descriptor, those who did good and those who did evil, out of those 39, only 6 did good and 33 did evil. And God was fed up with it. God was fed up. In fact, it says in the Word that King Ahab and his wife, Queen Jezebel, were the most evil of the kings and queens up until that time. The nation of Israel was in a dark place. King Ahab was ruining the land, and they were worshiping this god named Baal, and Baal was getting all the credit as the god of fertility and rain. And God said, enough is enough. Forget it. Baal does not have control over the rain. I have control over the rain, not Baal, and I'm shutting off the taps. And your land is going to be as dry and as parched as your souls are until you repent. And immediately after Elijah delivers his message, God yells, run! And so Elijah runs, and we read this in verse 2. Then the Lord said to Elijah, go to the east and hide by the Kerith ravine near where it enters the Jordan River. Drink from the brook and eat what the ravens bring you, for I have commanded them to bring you food. So he goes to this ravine called Kerith, the Kerith ravine. The name means cut. To cut out, to cut off, to cut down, to cut up. It's all about segregating and cutting. This does not sound like a very fun place. In fact, Elijah must have said, God, what's the deal? I did what you asked me to do. I went to King Ahab and delivered this message that there was not going to be any rain, and now you're cutting me down, and now you're cutting me off, and now you're cutting me up. Here's my first observation. We're going to study why Elijah's prayers were so effective. And here's my first observation. Number one, often God cuts us down privately before he uses us publicly. Often God cuts us down privately before he uses us publicly. Now, I don't know how many of you have watched any of the latest round of church scandal documentaries that are out on Netflix and Prime and all sorts of other sources. They are sad. They are very sobering. But what we see is that far too often, people who are ministers, people who are pastors, have this grand and glorious stage presence, and they get all inebriated with the fame and the pride and materialism and popularity and sexuality of this whole thing. And eventually God takes them kicking and screaming to the Kerith ravine, to the place where they are cut down and cut off because of their pride until they learn. But quite often God actually does the opposite. Quite often God takes us to the Kerith ravine, the place where we are cut down and cut off and cut up, before he gives us a public ministry. And there's a reason for this. Because God is far more interested in your character than your comfort. God is far more interested in making you holy than he is in making you happy. He is far more interested in making you trustworthy than trendy. And the Kerith ravine, those places where we are cut down and cut off and have things removed and even removed from our souls. This is a place where God is preparing us for what he has next. He's preparing us for what he has next. Today, some of us are in the Kerith ravine. Some of us are in a really difficult place where we feel like, man, I feel like I've been cut off. I feel like I'm getting cut down. I feel like I'm getting cut up. I feel like stuff is being removed from my life and I have less of myself to lean on. And there's a reason for that. It's so that we lean more heavily on God. So we learn to trust God more fully to prepare us for what he has for us next. A couple of weeks ago, I was at a leadership retreat and we took a day to do this exercise. It was hard. It was hard work. And the exercise was this. We had a poster board and a whole bunch of sticky pads and sticky notes, and we were told and taught how to map our life. And so we mapped our life out with about 100 different sticky notes. And I won't go into all the details of how this works, but as I looked at my life, this is the picture of my life. As I worked through this in a day, I realized that God has taken me to the Kerith ravine at least 4 times in my life. where he's cut me off, he's cut me down, he's cut me up, he's allowed me to be in a place. But during those seasons in my life, as I can see it on my map, those are times when I have leaned more into him and my faith muscle has grown. And I've learned to become more dependent on him. One of the reasons Elijah's prayer life was so effective is because God took him to a tough place and he increased his dependence on God. Now, in the rest of chapter 17, God calls Elijah back after months of the Kerith ravine. He calls Elijah back into community. He tells him to go to a village to find a widow who has a son, and he's supposed to live with them. Now, this is during when the drought is really difficult, and there is no food and flour. And so this widow is running out. She has the very last of her flour, the very last of her oil. And God does a miracle. For as long as Elijah lives there, the flour continues to replenish and the oil continues to replenish. And we see this miracle that Elijah is a part of. And then the woman's son gets sick and dies. And Elijah prays a prayer over the son, and another miracle happens. The son is resurrected back to life. That's the first recorded prayer of Elijah. And that brings us to 1 Kings chapter 18. It says this: later on, in the third year of the drought, so this drought's been going on a long time, the Lord said to Elijah, "Go and present yourself to King Ahab. Tell him that I will soon send rain." So Elijah went to appear before Ahab. Here's the second observation I have for you as to why Elijah's prayer life became so effective. Number 2, don't wait for conditions to be optimal before you're obedient. Elijah wasn't waiting for conditions to be optimal before he simply obeyed what God was telling him to do. A lot of us are all into obeying God's commands if it's not too hard, if it's going to benefit my life, if I'm going to be blessed by this obedience that I do, if it's going to be something that adds to my personal comfort, if it advances my cause. But Elijah didn't put any of those qualifiers in front of this. God told him to go to King Ahab, and he just did it. He was obedient. Now you got to realize that the famine is in its third year. Life is difficult. The economy is collapsing. Violence is increasing. The culture and the people are completely opposed to Elijah and his God. And this is the king who wants to kill Elijah. God says, I want you to go to the king who wants to kill you. And what does Elijah do? He simply obeys and does what God is calling him to do. Is there something that God's been asking you? Is there something that God's been telling you through his word? Is there something God, by the power of his Holy Spirit, has been calling you to, but you have been delaying obedience? You've been dragging your feet. You haven't been leaping into obedience quickly. You've been making all sorts of excuses. I'm encouraging you, if there is something God is calling you to obedience, be ready to leap into it quickly. A couple of winters ago, Carolyn and I had the tremendous privilege of taking our three adult daughters and their husbands to Mexico with us. And so 4 adult couples, three of them were our kids. What a blast we had for a week in Mexico. And we went to an eco park. And at this particular eco park, they had a lazy river, which was a beautiful river, these big tubes that we were floating down through the jungles and all this stuff. Then it opened up to where there was a little bit wider part of the river, and there was a cliff jump. Now, I got to be honest with you. I don't like heights. And I've never in my life jumped off a diving board. I don't like flying through the air. I don't think people were made to fly. And so I haven't jumped off a diving board. I definitely have never jumped off a cliff. But I had my son-in-laws and one of my daughters daring me. Come on, Dad, you're not a chicken, are you? I'm no chicken. It doesn't look that high. So I climb up there, and it wasn't that high. It was not that high of a cliff. But I tell you, I got up there, and things look different when you're up on the cliff than when you're down at the bottom, right? And so I got up there, and I knew I could back out, but I thought, no, I'm not going to back out. I need to do this. And so I'm arguing in my head. My brain is saying don't. My brain is saying back out and walk back down. And my body does something that tricked my brain. My body just simply just did it in a moment and jumped off the cliff and said, we'll deal with the consequences later. And I got to tell you, I screamed, and it was not pretty. In fact, I captured the moment.
That's a long way. Oh, I don't think I like it.
No, you can't. It's only one way. The kids behind you can do it.
Ah!
Now, I realize that was a very short scream because it was not a very high cliff, okay? But I was terrified. I was scared to death. You know, it wasn't like I was screaming on and on and on. It was a short little cliff. But there's a principle in this, and it's this: take the leap of obedience and deal with the consequences as they come. If God is calling you to something, take the leap of obedience. Don't overthink it. Don't try and rationalize it all out. Don't back out. Take the leap of obedience. I've done this a number of times for Carolyn and I when it's come to one of our capital campaigns to build one of our 6 buildings here, and it's been like I've been sensing God calling us to a bigger number than I was comfortable with. I said, okay, we're just going to take the leap of obedience. We're going to write the check and we're going to deal with it later. When I feel like I need to confront somebody and maybe send an email to somebody and say some difficult things in love, but some difficult things that I know they are not going to like to hear, it'd be so easy for me to back out. But when I sense the Holy Spirit spurring me on, I type the email and I hit send and say, okay, I'm going to deal with the consequences later. There have been times in my life where I've needed to pick up the phone and have a difficult conversation, maybe confessing a sin to somebody or that I have hurt somebody and asking for forgiveness, and it's the hardest thing to do. And what I've learned to do is pick up the phone and dial the number and deal with what happens next after I've been obedient. And sometimes you just simply need to leap into obedience. That's what Elijah did. Now, I think that the first reason her prayers were so effective was, number one, he was cut down privately, and he was willing to learn dependence on God before God used him publicly. Such an important order. And number two, he didn't wait for conditions to be optimal before being obedient. Okay, let's continue on in 1 Kings chapter 18. It says this: when Ahab saw him, he exclaimed, "So is it really you, you troublemaker of Israel?" "I have made no trouble for Israel," Elijah replied. "You and your family are the troublemakers, for you have refused to obey the commands of the Lord and have worshipped the images of Baal instead. Now summon all of Israel to join me at Mount Carmel, along with the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who are supported by Jezebel." So the people and the prophets all gather together on Mount Carmel, and Elijah says, okay, bring me 2 bulls. He says, we're going to have a showdown. He says, you prophets of Baal, you 850 prophets, you build your altar. You put your stones there. You stack up your dry firewood and your kindling. You put the bull on top of there, and then you stand back and you pray that your God would light that fire. And so you know the story. Those prophets, they prayed and they wailed all day long until their voices were hoarse. They screamed. When their God was not listening, they began to cut themselves and try to get their God's attention, and so they're all bloody and cutting themselves. In fact, Elijah literally says this to them. He says, "You'll have to shout louder," he scoffed, "for surely he's a God. Perhaps he's daydreaming, or maybe he's out relieving himself. Or maybe he's on a trip, or is asleep and needs to be awakened." And they do everything they can. And when they are exhausted and all these prophets are collapsing and a bloody mess, Elijah steps up. And he takes the altar of the Lord that had been torn down, and he rebuilds this place of worship and the altar of the Lord with the rocks. And then he puts the wood on top. And then he puts the bull on top. And then he takes 4 large barrels of water, and he drenches the bull and the wood and the altar with these large barrels of water. And then Elijah prays a prayer. "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, prove today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant. Prove that I have done all of this at your command. O Lord, answer me so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God and that you have brought them back to yourself. And this prayer leads to a third observation of why Elijah's prayers were so effective. Number 3, he knew that feeble prayers would not ignite a fire. He knew that feeble prayers would not ignite a fire. I don't know of anybody who is more prolific and knows more about prayer than Edward Bounds. E.M. Bounds was born in 1835. He grew up and trained to be an attorney, a lawyer, but he found that law didn't really do it for him. What he was more into was prayer. And so he quit the law profession and he became a chaplain in the military. And when the U.S. Civil War was over, he became a pastor, began to pastor in Tennessee. A 2-word description of E.M. Bounds would be prayer extraordinaire. This guy, he wrote 3 large volumes on prayer. There's some of the best stuff. He's thought through prayer in ways that most people have not. And I want to read for you his observations about Elijah. Listen to this. Elijah's praying was strong, insistent, and resistless in its elements of prayer. Feeble praying secures no results and brings neither glory to God nor good to man. Elijah could touch nothing but by prayer. God was with him mightily because he was mighty in prayer. Elijah prayed really, truly, and earnestly. How much of prayer is there at our present time, and this was written in the mid-1800s, how much praying is there in our present time, which is not real praying, but is mere shucks, and mere words? Much of it might well be terminated non-praying. The world is full of such praying. It goes nowhere. It avails nothing. It brings no returns. In fact, no returns, no results are ever expected. Elijah's prayers were so effective because God took him to a difficult place and he learned to depend on God, because he was quick to obey God, and because he did not pray feeble prayers, but rather he prayed fiery, bold, gutsy, and full of expectation prayers that God would act. His prayers were not feeble. So God responds to Elijah's prayer and lights the altar on fire. In fact, fire falls from heaven. It consumes the bull. It consumes the water. It consumes the wood. It is so powerful, it consumes the stones and even the ground. It left a crater where the altar used to be. It even consumed the ground. In other words, God does more than you can ever ask when you pray bold, gutsy prayers. All right, you're doing great today. We got 2 more prayers that Elijah prays, and then we've covered his entire life. The next happens when God tells Elijah to pray for rain. And this is in chapter 18, verse 42. It says this, "So Ahab went to eat and drink, but Elijah climbed to the top of Mount Carmel and bowed low to the ground and prayed with his face between his knees." Number 5 reason his prayers were so effective, or number 4, is Elijah prayed with humility. Elijah knew how to pray bold, fiery, faith-filled prayers, but he also knew how to get low and to bow down and put his head between his knees and just beg God for mercy and help. He was a man who prayed with humility. Verse 43, "Then he said to his servant," and he's praying for rain, so now he says to his servant, "Go and look out towards the sea." And the servant went out, looked there, and returned to Elijah and said, I didn't see anything. 7 times Elijah had him go to take a look. Finally, the 7th time, his servant told him, "I saw a little cloud about the size of a man's hand rising from the sea." Number 5, Elijah's prayers were effective because he prayed persistently. He didn't pray once. He didn't pray 2 times. He didn't pray 3 times. He prayed and then sent his servant out to look with expectancy. What's happening? What's happening? Oh, nothing. I'll pray again. And then I'll send my servant out to look with expectancy. What's happening? Nothing. I'll pray again, and I'll pray again, and I'll pray again. He did not know what was blocking his prayers. He didn't know how long this was going to take for God to answer. He didn't know if he was going to have to pray 37 times and send his servant out 37 times. But he did not give up. He did not quit. He prayed persistently. Let me ask you something. Has God put something on your heart to pray for maybe in the last number of years, and you've just stopped praying? You didn't see results, so you just kind of quit and you gave up. Is there a prayer that God has you praying or wants you to be praying that you need to pick up again? And you need to start getting a little more bold and a little more fiery and a little more persistent. All right, verse 66, we're moving our way through, the next verse here. Then Elijah shouted, "Hurry to Ahab and tell him, climb into your chariot and go back home. If you don't hurry up, the rain will stop you." Now, this is an absolutely laughable situation. It leads us to number 6. Elijah envisioned God's answer to his prayer. Elijah envisioned God's answer to his prayer, but it's a laughable situation because there had been no rain for 3.5 years. And now this rain cloud that was forming might not even be a rain cloud. There's a little cloud on the horizon about the size of a man's hand. It was nothing. It was a sunny day. And what does Elijah say? Hurry off to Ahab and tell him, if you don't hurry and get into your chariot and get home, you're going to be caught in a monsoon thunderstorm and you're going to get stuck in there and you're going to get very, very wet. It's going to become dangerous. It's going to be torrential rain. But there was nothing. Ahab and his servant would have looked around and gone, what are you talking about? It's a sunny day. There's a little cloud over there. It's a sunny day. But Elijah was envisioning what God was going to do. He was already envisioning how God was going to answer this prayer long before God did it. This would be like a person praying fervently for an estranged family member. And they're so confident that God is going to answer this prayer that they set an empty table and setting at the table, an empty chair and setting at the table every meal in anticipation for that person coming back home to the family. They're just so confident that they actually do something physical about it. This is like the couple who is so confident that God is going to help them become pregnant, but it's been difficult, that they go out and they buy a crib and they paint the baby room. That's how confident they are that God is going to move. This is like the couple who, or the guy maybe, who is so confident that God is going to bring somebody into his life for him to marry one day, that he goes out and buys a ring in advance before he's even dating anybody. Now, I'm not saying that by doing those things, you move the hand of God. I'm not saying if you want a new car, you go out and buy a wheel wrench in anticipation of your new car. I'm saying that these people, that Elijah was so confident that God was going to answer, that he actually acted on that. He told Ahab, if you don't get moving, you are going to get caught in this rainstorm. So this brings us to the end of his life. So Ahab goes home. Ahab tells his wife Jezebel about what has happened, and Jezebel loses her mind. She becomes so angry that she says, may the gods kill me if I don't kill Elijah before this day is over. And Elijah prays his last recorded prayer. And here's what it says. I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who have already died. This man who God had trained in the Kerith ravine to be dependent on him. This man who had saw flour and oil multiply for months at God's provision. This man who had prayed over a dead boy and watched him resurrect to life. This man who declared there will be no rain in this land until I pray again, and there was no rain for 3.5 years. This man who charged and challenged the 850 prophets to do their best to light the fire, and then drenched the altar with water and prayed, and God leapt the whole thing up and lit it all up. This guy who was a rock star amongst prophets and a superstar amongst prayers. This guy who was a spiritual giant who we're still talking about 3,000 years later, got tired. And he got discouraged. And he got worn down. And he got burnt out, and all he wanted to do was die. Elijah could have fallen on his own sword. Elijah could have ran in front of a speeding chariot. He could have jumped into a raging river. But instead, he trusted God with his life, and he trusted God with his death. So whatever happened to Elijah? Well, after this moment of such discouragement and being down, God takes Elijah to a cave, has him sit at the entrance of the cave, and God puts on this spectacular show. The show of force started with a windstorm that ripped rocks from the mountain where Elijah was hiding. And that windstorm was followed with an earthquake that shook the trees and split the rocks in half. And then that earthquake was followed with a wildfire that just filled the entire country with hazy smoke all over the sky. But it says that God was not in the windstorm, God was not in the earthquake, God was not in the wildfire. And what came next in front of that cave was a gentle, quiet whisper. And God was in the whisper. And what did God say to Elijah? I think he said the same thing that he's saying to some of us today. God said, I'm not finished with you yet. I'm not finished with you yet. It's not time for you to go. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to give you strength again. I have a next mission for you to go on. I'm not finished with you yet. And that is Elijah's life. The entire thing in 8 chapters, 4 prayers. Now, I realize that 7 points of how to be an effective prayer is a lot to take in. So we have a few moments left at the end of our service. Here's what we're going to do. And this is going to maybe get just slightly awkward. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to pray. And for some of you, 2 minutes is going to feel like an eternity. For those of you online, you're going to see a slide up for 2 minutes. And you're going to go, did something happen? Did something break? It didn't break. We're going to give you 2 minutes. In fact, we're going to post the 7 lessons from Elijah on the screen right now. And as we post these, here's what I want you to do at home and here. I want you to pray for 2 minutes and ask God, God, I can't take 7 points home with me today, but I can take 1. What is the one thing that you want me to focus on? What is the one takeaway out of Elijah's life that you're asking me to put into practice in my life? Okay, we're going to take 2 minutes. You can look at that list. You can pray through that list. You can take some time. Some of us haven't slowed down to actually pray and talk to God for this entire last week. Well, let's take 2 minutes. And when that 2 minutes is done, our worship team is going to lead us in a song of response.